Sweden. Known the world over for its diverse culture, fine craftsmanship, precision engineering, exquisite cuisine, and of course, its music. From traditional folk to American-style rock and roll, to glam rock to metal, Sweden's contribution to popular music cannot be overstated. Like almost everywhere else in the Northern Hemisphere, Sweden was hit by the punk pandemic in the late 70s. The Ramones and Talking Heads landed in Stockholm during the spring of 1977, and the Pistols followed that summer, playing in Halmstad. By early 78, punk bands had sprung up all over the country. Unlike the US and UK, where punk's first wave crashed as soon as it was named, it took about 10 years for punk to fizzle out in Sweden, with crossover thrash and metal becoming the preferred loud music. It was around this time that a young metalhead named Dennis Lyxzén was given a cassette tape with a copy of the Cro-Mags' Age of Quarrel on one side and a Misfits album on the other. He was transformed.
Yo, what is it, Bob? It's new.
Hi everybody, Brendan here with another edition of This Month in Punk Rock History. It's October 2023, and this month in punk rock history, we'll take a look at the scene Lyxzén was instrumental in creating, and the release that shook the world. The Shape of Punk to Come, a chimerical bombination in 12 bursts by Umea Sweden's Refused, which was released worldwide on October 27, 1998. But first...
And I want you to help me. So listen up, kids. Grab a jar can and get your mom and dad to take you to all your friends and neighbors and ask them to put some money in it for
Sweet Jimmy Network.
Then get your mom or dad to drive you down to your
Our eBay store.
Put your money in the big fish bowl. Maybe you even get on TV like me and tell them Mr. T sent you, okay?
Thanks, Mr. T. I pity the fool who misses out on the great deals at the Sweet Jimmy Network eBay store. Proceeds support this channel. While we're talking about thrifty things, why not check out Tales from the Thrift, available here and on TikTok. Links in the description. Now back to This Month in Punk Rock History. Mind your history, children.
In the beginning, God created
blues and jazz.
And the jazz was formless.
Developed in the beginning of the 20th century, jazz took the reins of popular music away from the composer and placed them in the hands of the performers. It was largely improvisational and spawned a number of subgenres such as Dixieland, swing, and bebop, among others. Over the years, though, jazz had become less exciting and more codified. That is until 1959, when Ornette Coleman defied tradition, abandoned chord structure, and redefined the genre, saying, quote, "Jazz is the only music in which the same note can be played night after night, but differently each time." Coleman's landmark album, The Shape of Jazz to Come, featured the track Lonely Woman, which would become a jazz standard, and the album influenced new movements within jazz, including avant-garde and free jazz. 40 years later in Sweden, a hardcore punk band that had been steadily gaining an international fan base took a page from Coleman's playbook and defied the rules of hardcore. With a title that pays homage to the jazz legend, 1998's The Shape of Punk to Come by Umea Sweden's Refused challenges the rigidity of punk's definition by including elements of jazz, techno, and folk, as well as post-hardcore and post-punk. It was the group's magnum opus. It was simultaneously their Sgt. Pepper and their Let It Be.
But you don't have to take my word for it.
I've never heard of Refused, but The Shape of Punk to Come is a pretty intriguing title, and while the album does display a lot of different musical shapes, punk doesn't seem to be one of them. I'm hearing hardcore metal, Slayer, Death, even Mr. Bungle, but punk? I want my punk to be short songs with basic chords and melodies that sound like amped up old rock and roll songs and shouting and anti-establishment lyrics, and this is not that. Maybe that's the point, but that's not entirely true. Refused does have a lot of interesting things to say in the lyrics, but you can't understand any of them. I'm not opposed to screaming, but screaming unintelligibly, why bother? And that's all this guy does for an hour. Yawn. What hit me the most was the musicality and the riffs, the grooves, the arrangements, and the sharp, clean, timeless production, especially on Summer Holidays versus Punk Routine and the title track. I'd prefer to listen to an instrumental version of this album while reading a book of the lyrics. It may not live up to the title, but for a 1998 album to still sound like the shape of something to come, even if that something hasn't come a quarter century later, is pretty impressive. I just hope the vocalist larynx is okay.
Thanks, Daniel. As I said earlier, by the mid-1980s, the raw excitement and danger of punk rock had become commodified and commercialized, leaving a void in underground music.
Do you really think I'm punk? Well, that's outrageous. I mean, it's not as cool as New Wave, but it's a lot better than Preteen.
In the US, this vacuum was filled by early hardcore like the Dead Kennedys on the West Coast, Minor Threat in DC, and Youth of Today in New York. In the UK, bands like GBH, Discharge, and The Exploited pioneered a more metal-influenced brand of hardcore that would come to be called UK 82. In Sweden, the hardcore revolution was led by Anti-Cimex and Mob 47. Meanwhile, in the small Northland town of Umeå, teen record collector Dennis Lyxzén was listening to bands like Anthrax and Slayer when he discovered in his collection The Exploited's Troops of Tomorrow LP. Lyxzén was intrigued but still not caught in the quicksand until the aforementioned Cro-Mag's Misfits split copy came into his possession in 1987. From there, he discovered bands like Crumbsuckers and Agnostic Front. Lyxzén tells podcaster Damian Abraham that he was one of only a handful of punks at the time, and the only one of his friends to favor hardcore over punk rock. Pouring through thank you lists, photographs of bands wearing different bands' t-shirts, and Thrasher magazine, Lyxzén expanded his knowledge and refined his tastes. Through trial and error, buying unheard music through mail order and the one or two local record shops, Lyxzén zeroed in on New York hardcore and became enamored with youth crew culture. In 1989, Lyxzén, along with friends Henrik Jansson, Jens Nordien, and Toft Stad, started the group Step Forward. Widely regarded as one of the first straight-edge hardcore bands in Sweden, Step Forward pays homage to their influences with covers of songs by the Misfits, 7 Seconds, and Minor Threat, in between songs championing the straight-edge lifestyle. MRR calls them an angrier and sometimes faster version of Minor Threat. They put out 2 demos, which were later compiled along with live recordings and an aborted EP session into an anthology record. At the same time, Lyxzén played bass in a group called Garbage Pail Kids. Sonically ranging from 77 punk to 90s hardcore with a tinge of Misfits, Garbage Pail Kids covered Swedish pop group Angel, American pop star Paula Abdul, and the stars of last month's video, Screwdriver. Yeah, I'm not even joking. Similar to Step Forward, they put out a couple of demos and a compilation before fading into obscurity. These were just 2 of the 10 bands featured on the 1991 cassette sampler Umea Hardcore The Way It Is, put out by Lyxzén's Umea Hardcore label. Also featured on that compilation is a band called Brain Squashed Puppies with Christopher Steen, Matthias Abramson, Par Hansen, and David Sandstrom. These and pretty much all the rest of the bands from that comp dissolved around 1991, having rarely, if ever, played outside Umeå. And much like the early New York and London scenes, audiences at these shows were largely comprised of other bands. In 1991, Lyxzén teamed up with Par Hansen and David Sandstrom of Brain Squashed Puppies, along with bassist Jonas Lindgren to form Refused. Drawing further influence from Dutch bands Sea and Red and Manlifting Banner, Refused shifted focus more towards politics while maintaining their vegan straight-edge background. They played their first gig in February 1992. At the same time, the remnants of Brain Squashed Puppies recruited Lyxzén's younger brother Jonas as drummer and friend Jose Saxland for vocals to form Abinanda.
Vi var ju väldigt få, vi var kanske 10 pers då, varav hälften spelade i Refused. Och liksom de 5 som inte spelade i band, när Refused repade, vi startade ett band istället.
From that point forward, these 2 bands worked to stabilize the burgeoning Umeå scene. In order to build the scene properly though, bands from outside the small city would need to play there. Lyxzén and Saxland attempted to book their hardcore heroes, but were frequently rejected because of the town's remote location. In 1993, they were successful in securing the Krishna core group Shelter, who played with Abinanda and Refused in front of about 600 people. The scene was solidified. In 1994, Refused toured Sweden, and in 95 they embarked on their first European tour, playing in support of Snapcase in Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, and Switzerland, before returning to Sweden to play Bergslös Rocken Fest. They were happy for the exposure and hardly paid for these gigs.
Yeah. Do you have $1? All I have is a 5. Do you guys have any change?
Along the way, they slept in tents or in the car. Bassist Magnus Björklund wasn't about this life and left the band after that festival gig. Björklund, their second bassist, started his own band, Cobalt. Meanwhile, the Refused struggled to replace him. In 1996, Refused toured the US with Snapcase. This was their first American tour, and the culture shock, well, left them shook. Lixon says the Americans either liked the music or the politics, but rarely both. In an interview published in Gabriel Kuhn's Sober Living for the Revolution, Lixon says, quote, "All the straight-edge kids we met were complete idiots, while the people we could identify and hang out with were the political punk kids. It was frustrating for us." In the US, Refused was distributed by Victory Records, one of the largest independent labels at the time and home to bands like Snapcase, Earth Crisis, and Strife, among others. There was a certain sound and image associated with Victory, and the intellectual anarchist rantings of these skinny Swedish kids didn't quite meet the audience expectations.
We got a new album out on Victory called Songs to Fan the Flames of Discontent. That's originally a song and textbook written by workers of the world. Unite the workers of the world. And one guy that wrote a lot of songs was a Swedish anarchist called Joe Hill. And he got killed at the beginning of this century. The song goes out to him.
Lixon goes on to say, quote, "Coming back from that tour, it seemed like we were caught between the PC punk scene that wouldn't accept us and the Victory crowd itself that we felt we had nothing in common. It was alienating." He tells Turn Out a Punk podcast that it was the experience of this tour that, quote, "gave us the shape of punk to come."
And then we toured America and everything changed.
What was the first American tour?
96 with Snapcase, opening up for Snapcase.
Okay, what was that like, the experience of that?
It is the experience that gave us shape of punk to come, you know.
The metal-tinged music of Refused's second album, Songs to Fan the Flame of Discontent, fit right in with the Victory Records sound, but the political lyrics were more akin to rival Ebullition records. And so they were caught in this tension and rejected by both sides. They returned home to Umeå feeling disconnected from the scene. When it came time to enter the studio again, they were fed up with the constraints of a defined genre and set out to do something more intentionally eclectic. By this time, the band members had grown apart, both personally and musically. Each of them seeking to explore new directions brought something unique to the album. Guitarist John Brandstrom was into house music and introduced sampling and electronics, while guitarist Christopher Steen and drummer David Sandstrom were into avant-garde jazz, drawing on Charles Mingus and including a sample of an introduction to a Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Candido Camero collaboration. Lixon amped up his intellectual and political punk rock influence, continuing with political themes and incorporating texts from Allen Ginsberg and Henry Miller. The jazz influence continues with the album's cover and title. The artwork is styled after New Jersey hardcore group Rye Coalition's album Teenage Dance Session, itself a copy of Dan Terry's big band album of the same name. Like The Shape of Punk to Come, Terry's album was difficult to define, blurring the lines between traditional big band and early rock and roll. The title is an homage to the Ornette Coleman LP I mentioned way back when we started this journey. "We were just so fed up of the hardcore punk scene," says Lixon, "we could have called the record Fuck You." There is a lot of contempt in that title. Indeed, Kerrang! Magazine calls the title fabulously cocky, and music analysis series Trash Theory says,
"The title alone is a statement of where the band were at the time of recording. There's an arrogance there, but also a barely concealed aggression."
The album also marked a return to Burning Heart Records, who put out the band's first EP. That same year, California-based Epitaph Records bought controlling interest of Burning Heart and the rights to distribute The Shape of Punk to Come in the US. This alleviated some concern over getting paid and also freed the band from being painted with the Victory Records brush, but it wasn't enough. No one said it out loud, but they all seemed to know that this was the end. Recording this album, quote, definitely came with an urgency, Steen told Vice's Dan Ozzie in 2015. In 2019, Lixon told Turned Out a Punk podcast that on their very first show, they assumed before they went out that no one would like them, so they were just going to go full steam ahead and leave it all on stage. The recording of this album had a similar all-or-nothing energy. In that same Vice article, Sandstrom says, "We were sick of each other's scents, sick of each other's voices." They wrapped the album at the end of 1997. They shot the video for New Noise and headed back on the road, starting with dates in Europe and the UK before a small venue tour of the US. Hardcore fans were cool towards the new sounds. Even on their home turf, they failed to fill clubs. Lixon called it a fucking disaster. At London's Red Eye Club, only around 30 people attended the show, and it was cut short when Lixon collided with the head of Ulf Nyberg's bass, leaving the frontman with a gushing head wound. That was May 28, 1998. The tour continued, and they spent the rest of the summer playing festivals in Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and Sweden. The entire tour was plagued with malfunctioning equipment, fights, sometimes physical, between band members, and drums destroyed out of frustration.
I don't know what's going on.
In September, they flew to the US for a tour of small venues. The burnout was obvious. Jason Homaker, drummer for DC post-hardcore band Frodis, who booked most of the shows on that tour, is quoted in the Harrisonburg Citizen as saying, quote, mentally, they were so over it by the time we got on the road. Honestly, they shouldn't have come. He told Vice, quote, they were just not in the headspace to do it. Guitarist John Brandstrom showed up having lost his equipment to the airline's lost luggage limbo, but didn't even seem fazed by it. The short tour of the East Coast is now legendary. The story goes that the band agreed in Atlanta to call it quits. They would finish this tour and make enough money to fly back home, and they'd go their separate ways. Guitarist Christopher Steen said of the breakup, quote, it was nothing unusual, just four guys that were beginning to not stand each other anymore. Word got out, and by the time they reached their final gig, just over 100 miles outside of Washington, D.C., the crowd started to swell again. Harrisonburg, Virginia's so-called 401 house was not a regular venue per se. It was an unassuming brick ranch house near James Madison University. Matthew Strugar, who lived in the house at the time, remembers as many as 200 people crowding into the tiny basement. The opening act was metal band Darkest Hour, who, Strugar says, quote, insisted on playing with full stacks. This drew noise complaints and police attention early.
If you can play, you don't need 12 amplifiers stacked upside the wall for a bass fiddle. 15 amplifiers with a guitar, and all of them 600 watts apiece. Refused
opened with the title track of their new album, followed by Refused Party Program, before starting into crowd favorite Rather Be Dead. The cops showed up and marched down to the basement. They gave everyone a chance to voluntarily end the show. In Steen's 2006 documentary about the demise of the band, Lixon says he instinctively chose to continue singing in defiance, while drummer David Sandstrom felt relief that this nightmare would finally end with the inevitable intervention of the police, who did indeed literally pull the plug on the show.
Oss på något vis. Och jag tror att det var precis tvärtom hur publiken kände. Att där kom fienden och stängde ner oss. Men att jag hade kunnat kyssa nästan. Så det var som att jag satt på och tittade. Jag kunde inte ens spela. Jag la bara ifrån mig trumstockarna. Det gick lite så här långsamt bakom gitarrförstärkarna av scenen. Men publiken hade börjat skrika.
That was it. October 6th, 1998. That was it. The Refused are fucking dead. The new album hit American stores 3 weeks later, but by then the band had moved on. Steen tells Buddyhead that after that show, Lixon and Brandstrom went home, and he and Sandstrom stayed in the US for a while. Lixon immediately recruited Sarah Almgren, former guitarist for all-female Umeå hardcore band Donuts, to start a new political punk band called The International Noise Conspiracy. Brandstrom pursued a career as a DJ. Steen attended film school while he and Sandstrom both worked for Revelation Records. A grand finale press release was quickly posted on the Burning Hearts Records website. The 980-word meandering manifesto of an open Dear John letter angrily justifies the necessity of the breakup, saying, "It is impossible to take part of a revolutionary program when every aspect of existence has to be projected as entertainment and music." This statement concludes with the declaration that members will never play as a group again. Brandstrom said of the announcement, quote, 3 of the 4 members were not involved in the writing and publication of this, and I didn't think it felt that relevant then nor now. It had, for example, very little to do with reality. Indeed, according to Steen, quote, there was basically a big rift between the singer and the whole band. Lixon admits in an alternative press interview that he was not the easiest to be around.
And to be completely honest, I was the guy that was like coming to the practice space screaming stuff like, I don't care about the music, it's a bourgeois notion, I just care about revolution. So, I wasn't the easiest person to be around.
Lixon is quoted in that Vice article saying, quote, refused is two things, an entity and an idea. When an entity is in motion, it remains in motion. The New Noise video started getting attention from MTV and soon was heard in movies, video games, and television shows.
She saw her face. She saw his face. She's not walking.
It was a slow burn that became a wildfire. According to Vice, the album sold only 1,400 copies in its first year, then 21,000 the following year, and 28,000 the year after that. As of the 2015 writing of that article, 180,000 copies had been sold in the US alone. Fueled by reissues of Shape between 2002 and 2010, and Steen's 2006 post-breakup documentary, Refused Are Fucking Dead, offers started pouring in for a Refused reunion. By that time, the anger and resentment among the band members had mostly cooled, and they started gravitating back towards each other. Sandstrom, Steen, and Brandstrom formed Text, which was more of an open-door collective than a true band. Lixon and Sandstrom formed the group AC4. Brandstrom helped write and produce Sandstrom's solo project, and Brandstrom helped Sandstrom with his solo project. So, did their 1998 statement of an album shape punk to come? Frank Turner named his band after a line from the Apollo program was a hoax. Paramore lifted a line from Liberation Frequency in their 2007 song Born for This. Orange County post-hardcore band Mikoto covered The Deadly Rhythm on their 2010 EP Transitions, and New Noise has been covered by American metal band Anthrax and rap rock crossover act Crazy Town, among countless others. Retrospectively, the critics generally loved the record. Remember that it was largely ignored when it first came out. It has drawn praise from musicians including Kirk Hammett, Duff McKagan, Tom Morello, Chester Bennington, Tom DeLonge, Dave Baksh of Sum 41, Davey Havoc of AFI, Quinn Allman of The Used, Tim McElrath of Rise Against, Damian Abraham of Fucked Up, and many, many others. But as my esteemed colleague points out, the album isn't for everyone. Sonic Boom 6 parodied the title and several elements from the album on their 2012 song, The Rape of Punk to Come. Punk hardcore supergroup United Nations says on their 2008 debut, the shape of punk to come never came and will never come. In addition, online forums such as Reddit write off the album as a stylistic ripoff of Nation of Ulysses, although, to be fair, Lixon in particular has never shied away from citing them as an influence. Some people love the album, some people hate the album, but everyone has a reaction to it. So I ask again, did Refused set the template for the shape of punk to come? What do you think? Tell me in the comments. That's it for our look at the shape of punk to come. Thanks for joining me on this very special crossover episode. Thanks to Daniel for sparing 60 seconds of his time. Be sure to check out his other 60-second album reviews and leave a comment on his videos if there's something you'd like to see him review. We're taking November off for some much-needed equipment upgrades, but join us in December for a very special Christmas episode of This Month in Punk Rock History. In the meantime, don't forget to check out my half-assed attempt to chronicle the day-by-day events of the scene via tiprh.start.page. For This Month in Punk Rock History, I'm Brendan McCabe.
You're watching the Sweet Jimmy Network, home of punk rock, old comics, and scruffy people that have no business putting their face on the internet.